So as Putin's war in Ukraine continues and the United States war with Iran intensifies across the Middle East, something huge is happening in Europe with its own security architecture. And most people haven't fully grasped it yet. You see, for decades, Europe's ultimate security guarantee rested overwhelmingly on one pillar, the US nuclear umbrella. But now France is solely signalling something different. President Emmanuel Macron has now announced that France will expand its nuclear arsenal and, more importantly, extend the logic of its nuclear deterrent, of its nuclear policy, to much of Europe, with specific engagement of some European allies. So, not through NATO and not under American command, but through a distinctively European framework. Therefore, that raises a profound question. Are we finally witnessing the first tangible step towards a European strategic autonomy of nuclear deterrence? Because if we are, it would mark the single most significant shift in Europe's strategic thinking and posturing since the Cold War. So in this video, I wanted to do three things. Firstly, look at what exactly Macron has announced and why it matters. Second, why France, who historically has been extremely protective of its nuclear independence and policy, is now opening the door to an entirely European dimension of deterrent. And thirdly, what this reveals about how European leaders are quietly but proactively preparing for a far more dangerous strategic environment. This is the Global Gambit. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the channel where, if you're new, we look at the strategy behind geopolitics, economics, and international relations, with a particular emphasis on the war in Ukraine, Europe's place in the world. But right now, this week, given the severity and intensity of the war across the Middle East, updates about the various angles of the United States versus Iran versus Israel. But before getting into all of that, when I saw this update, this development around what Macron had announced, it carried such potential impacts globally, let alone for Europe, that I wanted to specifically cover it. And before getting into it, though, I'm curious what you think. Do you personally believe that Europe ultimately needs its own nuclear deterrent, independent of the US? Or should NATO remain the sole specific pillar for European security? Let me know in the comments. So what specifically was announced? Well, France's President Macron delivered this significant announcement at a naval base in Brittany, the heart of France's submarine fleet. Now, the setting itself was very deliberate. Macron has a thing for presenting things in a very provocative and very, some people say, French meaning. You see, behind him sat one of France's nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines, the most survivable component of the country's nuclear deterrent, and very good at sending a message to various onlookers, not just adversaries, but certain unpredictable allies. Indeed, the message was equally deliberate. France will increase the size of its nuclear arsenal, which currently sits at roughly 290 warheads. Now, that is relatively small compared to the United States or Russia. I mean, it's tiny, both of which possess several thousand warheads and 1,500, at least for Russia, active at any one time. But France has long adhered to a doctrine known as strict sufficiency. The idea being quite simple, that you do not need thousands of weapons to deter an adversary. You only need enough to guarantee devastating retaliation. Indeed, only a few warheads of their modern types can obliterate humanity. In other words, therefore, the purpose of France's nuclear arsenal is not battlefield use. It is existential deterrence, which is really what nuclear policy is always about. So if an adversary were to attack France, the cost would be so catastrophic that the attack becomes irrational, and a debate that we often talk about makes no sense for Putin to do in the context of Ukraine. Now, Macron's announcement suggests France believes the existing level of sufficiency may no longer be enough. in the strategic environment that is emerging globally, let alone just on the border with Eastern Europe. This is also echoed by China, who has been gradually increasing its own stockpiles in the past couple of years, and some people speculating that China may have even carried out a nuclear test in the past few years, much similar to one that was done in the late part of the 20th century, known as the Vela project. But historical quips aside, there is a more important development, which is not about the number of warheads. It is who those warheads are meant to protect. You see, Macron unveiled what French officials describe as an advanced deterrence, a framework that involves several European countries, including Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, Greece, and the United Kingdom. These states will not control French nuclear weapons. They will not host permanent nuclear deployments. And France will not provide formal nuclear guarantees like the United States does through Europe. Indeed, the French president will retain full and exclusive control over any nuclear launch decisions. That principle, known as absolute national control, has been at the core of France's nuclear doctrine since Charles de Gaulle created the force de frappe in the 1960s. But this new framework introduces something different and somewhat builds on that. Simply that European partners will participate in exercises that involve France's nuclear-capable air forces. They may host French nuclear-capable aircraft during exercises or crises, and they will increase interoperability or cooperation on supporting capabilities such as missile defense, early warning systems, and long-range strike assets. Simply put, the deterrent remains French, but its strategic signalling becomes European. And indeed, this is a significant shift, especially for the United Kingdom, because as the only other European nuclear state, the UK has always had a unique approach to handling its nuclear capabilities in the form of Trident and the nuclear-powered subs. But the problem with that being is that the UK relies heavily and essentially the green light of the US to be able to use them. So this greater independence that the French are offering may incentivize the UK to follow suit, albeit in a slightly different way. That aside, why make this shift now then? The answer lies in the strategic environment Europe is facing. Russia's war in Ukraine has revived this central role of nuclear weapons in European security thinking. For years, many European governments believed nuclear deterrence was a legacy concept, something largely stabilized by Cold War arms control agreements and the dominance of, say, the American umbrella. This complacency and negligence that you perhaps have heard me criticize significantly. Now, that assumption is no longer safe. Russian officials have repeatedly invoked nuclear threats since the invasion of Ukraine, and whilst we probably shouldn't pay attention to the likes of Dmitry Medvedev or Vladimir Putin too much, it still begs the point that we live in a much more unpredictable world. Meanwhile, as we say, arms control regimes have eroded. Specifically, for example, arms control regimes have eroded, communication channels have deteriorated, and the geopolitical rivalry, especially amongst great powers, has intensified. Macron captured this shift bluntly when he declared that the coming decades would be an era of nuclear weapons. That statement reflects a broader fear across Europe, therefore. The strategic environment is becoming more dangerous, less predictable, and of course much more reliant on hard power. You can find links in the description to videos I've made about the importance for Europe to pursue a principled, pragmatist approach and no longer be dependent on any one power. Not America, not China, not Russia, but on themselves. And whilst we see steps, it's very frustrating with the lack of consistency and follow through with action versus the words that policymakers often give. And this shift by Macron, who, in my personal opinion, has been one of the biggest proponents of pushing for this, is a huge step. Then, of course, there is the elephant, or perhaps rhino, if you adhere it to the Republican Party, which is that Europe's security architecture has always depended on the United States, which is in a profound different place now. Ever since the Second World War, American nuclear forces have served as the ultimate guarantor. And yet the reliability of that guarantee is now being debated much more openly, if questioned entirely. And people like J.D. Vance say that we could just pull ground troops. It's not exactly something that European onlookers and officials can sleep easily over. Indeed, these political shifts in Washington, the rising global commitments, and the overall growing emphasis on competition, specifically with China, have led all the European leaders to largely increasingly ask a difficult question. What if the US becomes so unwilling or able to shoulder the full burden of European defence? What do they do? France's new doctrine does not replace NATO's entire nuclear umbrella. France can't do that. But Macron has been careful to emphasise that point, that it does not create something new. It's simply a supplementary European-led layer of deterrence. Within all of this, a purpose of deterrence is very importantly psychological, strategic signalling, shaping how potential adversaries calculate that risk. By involving multiple European states in this nuclear signalling framework, France complicates those calculations. An adversary contemplating aggression against a European country must now consider the possibility that France could view that aggression as threatening its own vital interests. And France's doctrine deliberately keeps those vital interests somewhat ambiguous. But that ambiguity is intentional, strategic ambiguity. Deterrence works best when adversaries cannot be certain where those red lines lie. But although in the case of Russia, when they threaten the idea of nuclear war because certain red lines have been crossed, well, we realise that they aren't real. But there are limits. Even combined, French and British nuclear arsenals are a fraction of the US's. America has 3.7 thousand nuclear warheads in its stockpile. France has less than 300 and Britain around 220. So this disparity means a pure European nuclear deterrent could not fully replicate the scale of America's umbrella. Critics, of which there are many, argue that without the United States, Europe's deterrent posture would overall just be weaker. But the point of Macron's proposal is not numerical priority, it's this strategic credibility. If adversaries believe Europe possesses the political will, which is most crucial for almost everything we're talking about these days, as well as the capability to impose catastrophic retaliation, then deterrence can still function even with a smaller arsenal. That's partly why China is increasing its own stockpiles, because it wants to be seen as an indisputable rival power to the United States or Russia. And therefore, you need as many nukes as them, simply from a symbolic standpoint. There is a political dimension to this, which is, for decades, many European countries were sceptical of France's proposals for the autonomy. France has been accused often of using these grand geopolitical visions as a way to promote its own defence industry or expand its influence within Europe. But the reaction to Macron's announcements, apart from the few critics, has been overwhelmingly positive. And it's not exactly like I like to see us having to increase nuclear arms, but we live in a world where it seems it is required. Both Germany and Poland have welcomed this initiative, framing it as part of this broader effort to strengthen European defence in the face of Moscow's approach, especially the growing divides that seem to be existing between parts of Western Europe, such as Spain, versus the East, like Poland and the Baltics, over the immediacy of this threat. So what does this all mean in practice? In the short term, not much will change, at least operationally. France retains the full control of its nuclear weapons, and NATO remains the central framework for deterrence. American nuclear forces remain the backbone, and they don't, well, seem to be going anywhere necessarily. But the direction of travel is clear. Europe is beginning to think very seriously about how it will deter threats in a world where American guarantees are seemingly all gone. Let alone for Ukraine, talking about security guarantees, Europe is having to take them seriously. And Macron's announcement is less about the warheads and more about the signalling. Europe is, as always, or unfortunately, slowly, cautiously, but seemingly preparing for a future where it has to manage for its own deterrence. Overall, Europe has lived under this protection of American nukes for a long time, making it complacent and perhaps short-sighted on not having to get things done or manage itself. France's new nuclear doctrine represents this first serious attempt to give Europe that additional layer of deterrence. And again, while it's not a replacement for NATO, it is a hedge against this seemingly multifaceted, multi-directional uncertainty. European countries that begin to integrate with this deterrence framework could mark the beginning of a really new big era in European security, but more specifically, European hard power. which in some people's minds is what's needed to complement its soft power and one of its biggest comparative advantages. If you enjoyed the video, do give it a like and subscribe. Join me on Substack where I'm writing about it as well, and we'll see you all in the next one. Click on this video if you want to know more about what Europe is doing to support Ukraine.